You're listening to The Social Workers on WCDB Albany.
And welcome to WCDB Albany. This is the Social Workers live radio talk show. My name is Eric Hardiman, and I'm here with my regular co-host, Alyssa Lotmore. Welcome back, Alyssa.
Hey, Eric, it's good to be back, especially talking about today's topic, which is sepsis.
We have a very interesting topic today. We have two guests in the studio who Alyssa will introduce in just a moment. One of them is a return guest, and so that's always exciting to have someone back on the show that we've talked to before, and to find out how progress has been, what kind of progress has been made in terms of raising awareness about this issue. And, I think it's such an important issue, and it's one that we were excited to help talk about, because people really should hear about it.
So one of our guests is Al Cardillo, who is the president and CEO of the Home Care Association of New York State and a very popular adjunct instructor at the UAlbany School of Social Welfare. So, Eric, as you mentioned, Al was on previously talking about sepsis. And I was going through my Twitter feed 2 weeks ago and I saw a post by a mother who had lost her 5-year-old daughter to sepsis. And it was about 2 years ago, and she was just saying she was still grieving. And I searched her name, and I saw the GoFundMe that was made for the child, and I read this whole story about this mother who had taken her daughter to the doctor. They thought she was fine, just go home and rest. A few hours later, they took her to the ER, and she had passed away at the ER. So I immediately thought of Al to come back on and talk about this topic. And Al had mentioned our other guest, Kathy Zazarine, who had lost her sister to sepsis, and how she's going to talk about how it impacted her entire family, still to this day. So I'm really happy to have Al and Kathy come on to share their story, to raise awareness, and to hopefully prevent future sepsis deaths and just grief for families.
Yeah, so welcome to the Social Workers, to both Al and Kathy. We're excited that you're here and looking forward to our conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. This is just such a great public service that you're doing to focus on this topic. So thank you.
Now, Al, before we jump into the whole, raising awareness and hearing Kathy's story, can you talk a little bit about what sepsis is for some of our listeners who might not know about it? I mean, even though it's taking so many lives each year, I think there's a lot of people, even in the medical profession, who don't always think of sepsis and know the signs and symptoms.
Yes, thank you so much. Yes, sepsis is the body's overwhelming and life-threatening reaction to an infection. It can cause tissue damage, organ failure, and ultimately death. And sepsis is responsible for over 270,000 deaths in the U.S. Every year. In fact, every 2 minutes, someone dies of sepsis. Every 20 seconds, somebody's hospitalized with sepsis. Sepsis is easily confused with other kinds of conditions. It could be a stomach ailment or flu, because pain is one of the symptoms of sepsis. So when it's in its early phase, which is really when it's most able to be effectively treated, it can be more difficult to recognize if there's not really an awareness of those signs and symptoms. Then later on, when it's really advanced, and a person, for example, enters septic shock, it becomes much easier to recognize, but then much more difficult to actually treat.
And it affects all ages, correct? I mean, I know there was a local boy, I think a year ago, I was reading an article in our local paper who had passed away of sepsis, and they thought he was doing better. His family, they kept doing updates, and then he eventually passed away. So it can affect anyone from young children to the elderly.
Absolutely. Older individuals have greater susceptibility because of comorbidities that they have, meaning they have other co-occurring conditions which increase the risk. For example, if an individual is prone to urinary tract infections or lung infections, of that nature. However, sepsis is said to be an equal opportunity killer, in fact, the current major state and national advocacy around sepsis started with actually two young individuals who died from sepsis. One was a 23-year-old woman just completing college and had a simple surgical procedure, developed an infection. It wasn't recognized as sepsis, and she died within days. In New York State, a 12-year-old boy, Rory Staunton, sustained a cut on his arm playing basketball, and within several days, he too died. And again, it was a situation similar to what you described in both of these cases, Alyssa, where an individual presented with symptoms, they weren't recognized as being associated with sepsis, and by the time intervention was ultimately implemented, the person didn't survive.
I also know, like as with other health conditions and other negative conditions in our society, that there are tremendous health disparities, right, with sepsis, and that I think the burden of sepsis, at least I know globally, I've read that the burden of sepsis on countries that are developing and countries that are facing extreme poverty, the burden of sepsis is much higher. I would also imagine the national literature shows that the burden on communities of color and of poverty, impoverished here in the U.S. are burdened at a higher rate by sepsis. Is that your understanding too?
Yes, that's absolutely true. And in national meetings that I've been in, for example, like the head of the Office of Minority Health for the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services have been part of those discussions. Very concerned about that. There's legislation that we've developed in the New York State legislature that is to try to provide a better response for health disparities, and sepsis is among those disparities that would be addressed in that legislation.
Right.
No, Al, you mentioned that by the time this is recognized, a lot of the times it's too late. And when you were here last time, you had given me a luggage tag, and it had the word time on it. And that stood for something. And I remember you're like, if you ever need to know the signs and symptoms, think of time. And I still have that luggage tag because I was like, after hearing you talk about sepsis, I was so scared afterwards. But it was such it was something I was like, oh my gosh, this is impacting so many people. I always save that luggage tag. So I know what time stands for, but can you talk to our guests, our listeners, about how we can be aware so we don't get caught too late?
Yeah, that's definitely right on the mark, Alyssa. So the Sepsis Alliance came up with this approach similar to when in trying to increase awareness for stroke or heart attack, to try to make these really a basic part of the general populace understanding to recognize these signs and symptoms that could be associated with sepsis. So in this case, time stands for T stands for temperature, either a higher or lower temperature. So sometimes a person feels like they're freezing, shaking, freezing. Other times, again, it's an elevated temperature. I stands for infection. There always has to be an infection. Sometimes it's recognized because the person has, say, strep throat or has sustained a cut. But other times, an individual might have had a joint replacement, a knee replacement. Maybe it's 10 years old, and maybe that area has become infected. The person doesn't really recognize it, but that is something that's present, or that they've had some kind of an injury which has resulted in an infection that they're not aware of. So these other symptoms are also very important along with it. M stands for an altered mental state, confusion, difficult to rouse. Many times in the elderly, for example, they are found on the floor, confused. They don't know why they've fallen, but the pursuit of the fall is what leads then to a conclusion that the person is in an altered mental state and needs further evaluation, and very often will be found to be septic. And then E stands for extremely ill. Symptoms related to sepsis are often described by a person saying they feel like they might die or this is the worst they've ever felt in their life. So T.I.M.E. And also time is important because for every hour treatment is delayed, there's a projected 8% increase in mortality. And along with death is also the risk of permanent impairment to body organs, amputations. There's about an average of about 38 amputations a day due to sepsis.
So we're joined also by our second guest, Kathy Zazarine, and Kathy, we're just honored to have you here and hoping that you would be willing to share your story with us and how it relates to sepsis. So thanks for being with us today.
Oh, thank you.
Can you maybe just start off by telling us the story that brought you here?
I'd be really happy to. My sister, Lois, was inspiring from our childhood. She just awed me with her persistence and her persuasion. If she wanted to make something happen, she did. And one thing she always wanted to do was to teach disabled children. She was very well spoken and planned to communicate with and for those who couldn't advocate for themselves. And with that goal in mind, she attended the College of St. Rose to study education and English. In December of her sophomore year, the first of two pivotal health changes occurred. She suddenly began to find it difficult to breathe, so she went to our family doctor. He said she was a typical student, advised her to learn to cope with stress, and dismissed her with no follow-up considered necessary. She was pretty ashamed for wasting his time and tried to follow his advice, but her breathing only worsened. So embarrassed, but needing to return after 4 months, she went back and he ordered x-rays. At that time, he found a disc-shaped tumor between her lungs. It was about the size of a plate. Further tests revealed that it was late-stage cancer. It was Hodgkin's disease, stage 3B out of 4. So at age 20, she started radiation, surgeries to remove her lymph nodes, the lump, and her spleen, and chemotherapy. During the chemo, she resolved to return to school, and our parents were very encouraging. Our mom actually had to drive her back and forth to St. Rose because the chemo made her so ill that she'd have to run out of the car, get sick on the side of the road, and return to lie down in the back seat of the car until they reached the school. But that's how strong her determination was, even as sick and weak as she felt. And then after class, she worked at St. Catherine's Center for Children, where she did the very physically demanding work of student teaching disabled children, some of whom were about as big as she was. She only had a 40% chance of survival, even with the chemo and radiation, but she held on to hope. A friend of mine named Ginny recently observed that Lois demanded her future, and I didn't know what that meant until I reflected on how she fought to reach her goals without losing faith, despite overwhelming odds. She earned her bachelor's, then her master's degree, met and married her loving husband, and 10 years after the cancer diagnosis, gave birth to her daughter, then her son 3 years later. Of all the things that she did, having children was what she considered the greatest. Eventually, her family moved to Minnesota, where my sister fulfilled other dreams. She worked with student teachers at a nearby college and launched the Adventure Learning Center for children at the church where her husband ministered, fittingly named Hope Chapel. On one morning in January, the center's opening was about to be announced, and she had started energetically, excited about the prospect of this new venture, but began feeling like a bad cold had started. And here began the second major health change of her life. By afternoon, she went from bad cold to becoming extremely ill. Her daughter said that she showed her the announcement for the Adventure Learning Center and her mother couldn't open her eyes or turn her head. Lois called her doctor, who said that she had a flu and would be fine in days. Now, again, my sister, I bring out this point over and over, was extremely well spoken. She did not quit. She was determined, and she clearly communicated her symptoms, but the doctor, she just didn't think she needed attention. And she must have said, I feel like I'm dying, because I later heard the doctor told her a lot of people feel like they're dying with this particular strain of flu. Unfortunately, by late evening, Lois was in great distress. Emergency responders came and initially echoed what the doctor said, that everything would be fine, until her heart stopped. Shockingly, she died at about 2 a.m. the next morning. That day, her children, ages 10 and 7, woke to find their mother gone. A week later, the doctor confirmed sepsis. Lois's husband was told that their children may not remember her, but that was wrong too. Their grief has been profound and prolonged. It was shocking, again, that 3 years after Lois's death, when her son was 10, he asked me, Aunt Kathy, do you know what it's like to feel so sad that you don't want to keep on living? And recently, it's been over 2 decades, he said he still relives his mother's death whenever someone he loves died. And his sister, also very strong and determined, similarly struggles. I want to say, before I get into the questions or concerns, this to her children. Your mom died over 20 years ago, but she lived for over 20 years after the cancer diagnosis. And during that time, she did so many amazing things, most importantly, giving the world you. She lived and she loved and she looked out for others so boldly, and we can do the same. If we can help other vulnerable people, we can continue her message and her mission to look out for people in need and maybe move from grieving to healing. And that's my sister's story.
Kathy, I want to thank you so much for the strength to come on and share that story. I mean, it's the impact on your family, not just your sister, but your whole family and her children, has been so profound. And I'm thankful that you came on to share her story, to help raise awareness, and to hopefully let others know who have experienced something similar, that they are not alone in this grieving process, and they're not alone.
Thank you.
I was just going to add, Kathy, thank you so much. The bravery and strength that it takes to share your own personal experience and family experience is just really remarkable. And it strikes me in listening to you, particularly the last portion of what you were saying, that telling her kids that her loss and that the grief from that loss can actually help other people, and that there can be growth in that is in part what social work is about too, is about sharing stories and sharing the experiences that people have individually and with family members, and trying to find some meaning from those stories, and trying to use that meaning to help others and to raise awareness, and to make a situation that is almost unbearable in terms of the grief, to turn it into something potentially positive to help others in a community. So thank you.
Well, I really appreciate that, because it's strange that you mentioned stories. My sister was telling stories at Hope Chapel a few nights before she died, and one of the little boys who she worked with drew a picture after she died for Lois's children to comfort them, and he drew her as an angel, and in what he wrote, heaven as haven. And I thought, you know what? She was always looking to create a haven for people who were either disabled or children, very young or elderly. She just wanted to protect. That was her passion. And I hope that the work that we do, whatever it is, will carry that on. And I want to give a shout out to social workers. Through so many phases of my family's lives, you've made an incredible difference. I remember after Lois died, the grief was enormous, and I can't imagine what that mother felt with her child, her toddler. I'm still over 20 years later trying to grapple with the meaning of it all. Mm-hmm. And it's been very painful because I think she was alone. Not that she wasn't surrounded by loving people. Her family loved her, as they did after the cancer misdiagnosis. She was always being reassured, you'll be fine, just as that mother heard. And yet how alone these people must be, because they probably have a sense that they are not going to be fine, but they can't convince anybody, despite their wonderful caring, their compassion, and in Lois's case, her ability to convince people to do what she thought was necessary. She couldn't do that on her last day of life. And she was a storyteller. My mom was a storyteller.
Interesting.
Social workers have told me stories to help me through the grief. And actually, I want to say this before I ask any questions. In the interest of helping others, social workers also did a great deal for my dad. Like some sepsis survivors, my dad led a very brave and full life after amputations. He was a war veteran, and his legs had to be amputated. And eventually, after years of hard work, his arms failed. And at that time, the Veterans Administration social workers gave him art projects to do. And not that this can put together the pieces or return my dad died 9 months after my sister did of a heart attack. But on the day that he woke up, the last day, he was singing because he was looking forward to a day of art at the VA. So social workers and art therapists put the pieces of our lives together in some ways. And if anyone needs art supplies, for some reason, I've taken thousands of photographs since I was about 10, long before it was trendy to do that. I have them developed, and I would be happy to donate them, particularly for people who are struggling with or surviving sepsis, their families, veterans, and those who cope with sometimes memory loss, because there are lots of cognitive, I think, implications to physical ailments. So if any social workers are out there need help or supplies for art or anything else, please let me know. I want to continue my sister's life. I don't want her story to end. I think she deserves it to continue.
Thank you, Kathy, for that. And if anyone is interested, feel free to reach out to me via email, which is on the website for the radio show, and I can connect you with Kathy. Now, Al, I had a question, and maybe you can answer. Kathy's story, when she talked about Lois, she said that she went to Lois went to the doctor. They didn't really pick up the signs or symptoms. That story that I was reading about the mother who took her child to the doctor, she's like, something's wrong. And they're like, oh no, just go home. She just needs some rest. How common is that for individuals to go seek medical help and be turned away because doctors or other medical professionals aren't picking up that it's sepsis?
Well, in the case of this condition, it seems far too frequent. The same exact situation that you described with regard to the 5-year-old and that Lois described was the situation that led Dr. Carl Flatley to launch the Sepsis Alliance in 2007, because according to Dr. Flatley, it was a word that nobody talked about and nobody used. And it was then until it was too late for his daughter. And at the time, one of the first tasks of Sepsis Alliance was to do a national survey to find out what percentage of the public had even heard the word. And it was something like, 19 or 20%, but then they only knew the word. So Sepsis Alliance, in 14 years of steady effort to educate the public, the latest poll shows about 50-some%, maybe 56%, have heard the word. But again, hearing the word and differentiating the symptoms is something very different. And of course, in the medical community, it's a similar situation. And I think part of it is because a person is presenting with symptoms which could be confused with something else. But I think if there was an overall awareness on the part of the public and an expanded awareness on the part of practitioners to look for this, then I think that there is that would make a difference. One thing is that was occurred as a result of the 12-year-old Rory Staunton's death from sepsis is that his parents created a foundation that is now called End Sepsis, the Legacy of Rory Staunton. And bringing their issue to the governor and the State Department of Health, they created a requirement that all hospitals in the state adopt a protocol so that when you're engaged in the emergency room, you must be screened for sepsis. So hospitals now must do that. That's a major change from what has existed historically, and as an organization that serves the substantially older people, but also medically fragile children, we know that a high percentage of sepsis risk is within our population. So we created as an industry protocol a special assessment tool and screening protocol for sepsis in the community, that right now is active in almost every county of the state, and we're looking to build on this going forward. One other piece is that through the work of the Stauntons, a law was passed by the legislature 3 years ago to require sepsis education as part of school health education. So coaches, teachers, et cetera, have to be learned in it, and that students will be informed. So progress is happening, but not fast enough.
So individuals, are there, as a family member or as an individual who might be feeling, knowing that time, warning signs, is there certain ways that we should advocate for ourselves, or is there certain...
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. And I'll refer to someone that we're working with right now. She's probably about 30, 31 years old. She is an individual who has recurrent sepsis. She had an episode when she was in college that basically destroyed her digestive functions, and she lives on a central line. That's how she takes her nutrition. So she must always have to be very cognizant of potential infection in the central line source where the port is, and it's because of her own vigilance. She also receives home health as a regular service to monitor her, but it's because she has that vigilance that protects her. So on a broader basis, I think it's really important that folks take insults to the body seriously. We like to tough out cuts and sometimes things that we think are going to be innocuous, but a small cut, a small insult, or something like a sore throat can become a very, very serious situation, and very quickly, just as Lois described. And so people need to be vigilant with those kinds of things. Obviously, abide things like, washing your hands and good sanitary things, but also to be watchful of loved ones, people that that might have had an effect like that. And are they now experiencing a fever? Are they confused? I mean, those are some very classic symptoms. And when that happens, it's important to call the doctor, or important to confer with 911 if necessary, depending on the condition of the person.
Al, can I ask a question then?
Absolutely.
So the doctor in Minnesota, who had seen her for years, knew her medical history, including the splenectomy, that can make flus and pneumonia potentially more serious. And although she described those symptoms that she had, and by the time I think she was talking to her doctor, her organs may have started to fail. She was really told that she would be fine by staying home and being calm. There are implications to going to an emergency room, particularly if your doctor tells you it's medically unnecessary. including financial. But they had great insurance. And so I'm not really sure what happened, except that within a day or two of Lois's death, her son became so ill, and the doctor wouldn't see him either. She just said, give him Tylenol and he'll get better. But my brother-in-law actually bundled him up and just presented him, I believe. And at that point, x-rays were taken and his lungs had been filling up with fluid.
Incredible.
So I think another reason why I'm grieving is that anger complicates grief quite a bit. And not that my sister, nor my brother-in-law, nor my parents ever said an angry word of blame about any medical professional. They really didn't, including Lois. But I'm thinking, I'm holding all of this in and wondering why the delays. And they did try. I mean, and my parents, my brother-in-law, we would have done anything. We would have carried her to the hospital if we thought that was indicated. And when you're as sick as someone was with Lois's cancer or sepsis, you don't necessarily have the time or energy to persist in advocating for yourself, nor does your family know enough. I mean, you do want to trust the medical professionals. Are there general guidelines as to when patients and families should seek other or additional medical help before it's too late? You know, you said call 911, but it's so hard to know with especially flus. And now that COVID presents such challenges, somebody could just have, you know, a cold, and we are thinking we need to run to the emergency room. Is there even understanding that there is not one magical answer for everybody? Are there some written guidelines that people can access? And also, is information routinely given to patients after splenectomies or other procedures that compromise immune systems to give them a warning or suggest conversations with healthcare professionals regarding possible precautions to consider, like vaccines, including COVID, flu, or pneumonia, or actions that they should take if they think it's an emergency, remembering that nobody wants to go to the emergency room if it isn't necessary. What do we as lay people do? And the most difficult question for me is, how do we better listen? I know that after she had cancer, and I didn't know that she was dying until after she died. It happened so fast. But when she recovered from the cancer, sometimes she would say that she was having breathing problems. I was so into reassurance mode that I never even thought, hey, maybe she has real problems and we should get her to the hospital. How can we listen better and also know when it's time to stop listening and start moving?
Well, I think some of what you said, in your very insightful thinking, is responding to some of the very questions that you asked. You know, there are circumstances, and that's why I referred to the 911. There are circumstances where you just have to take matters into your hands. I mean, I will tell you now, I'm alive today because when I was 5 years old, I had appendicitis. I was misdiagnosed. My appendix burst. And it was even though my father was assured by the pediatrician it was just a stomach bug, I never would be here today if my father didn't just say, there's something wrong with this kid. I've got to get him to a hospital. And even at the hospital was met by the pediatrician who said, I think it's a bug. Maybe we'll take an x-ray. And my father, the surgeon who delivered us by C-section was there and said, there's no time for that. We need to get him into surgery. And I was really touch and go for several weeks. So, you know, it's like that kind of a situation where you need to take those matters, or like the person that I was telling you, is working with us now as a consumer. Just take 1 second, because I know we're probably running close to the end of the program, but I did want to mention the points you're raising, Kathy, are points that we're trying to pursue in a new phase of our work in sepsis in the state. We've been given a very generous grant by the Mother Cabrini Health Foundation, and part of what it's supporting is the development of, let me call them guidelines, assistive material that can be used across the continuum. So there's a coordination between the EMT, the physician, physician, the hospital, the home care agency, both on the identification of potential sepsis, as well as when someone's being discharged and returned to the community for post-sepsis care. One of the situations that we found is that many patients are discharged home, and there's never an indication in the discharge that patient was treated for sepsis. So those individuals are at extremely high risk for recurrence and readmission to the hospital in a short period of time if they've already had sepsis. And of course, on the front end, if someone suspects sepsis, what is generally the advice from the community or from the professional community is to indicate to the hospital, I suspect sepsis. I think it might be sepsis, or calling the doctor. I think it might be sepsis. And this is all part of also an educational campaign to try to make sure that the public is really aware of what this is, which the show is really helping to serve. But it really takes an all-out effort from government officials, from advocacy organizations like Sepsis Alliance and like the Stauntons, the work that you're doing, and certainly the work that we and others are all trying to do to get everybody on the right page. So we're also as part of this initiative targeting underserved geography in the state where perhaps there has not been the development of either these preventive tools or dialogue to date, as well as populations that perhaps are not receiving the service that they should, and as well as the pediatric population. We're working right now on really what would be the first in the country tool to utilize in assessing sepsis in the pediatric population when they're receiving care in their home. So I'll just stop there, but a lot is occurring really in response to exactly what you said, Kathy.
Thank you.
So if you've just tuned in, you're listening to WCDB Albany, and this is the Social Workers Live Radio Talk Show, and we've been hearing from Al Cardillo and Kathy Zazarine. Al Cardillo is president and CEO of the Home Care Association here in New York State. And Kathy Zazarine unfortunately lost a sister to sepsis and was willing to share her story with us today. It's an incredibly powerful conversation that we've been having and privy to here. And one of the things that really occurs to me is the power of information. And so, you've talked just a minute ago, Al, about the need for information on so many different levels. There's the need for public information. There's the need for stories like families and survivors that Kathy so exemplifies. There's the need for information in the medical healthcare system and how information is disseminated and spread throughout that system to actually make change. But then there's also, something that really struck me in Kathy's words, particularly at the end, Kathy, was the need for listening, and that, stories are powerful and important, but they need to be heard. And medical professionals need to listen to patients, and they need to listen to families, and they need to listen to the people who have experienced these things and who have, it may not be medical expertise, but they have the expertise in their own lives. And it's really unfortunate that sometimes the systems of care that we have in place don't listen in the ways that they need to listen. And so it's just a powerful reminder to me that stories are important, but listening is also equally important.
Thank you.
And we only have a few minutes left, but I want to, as I was listening to Kathy share her story and talking about her own grief after this and sort of the anger and frustration that, about why wasn't this seen before, earlier. And you talked about your nephews, your niece and nephew, how they were grieving and still are, missing their mother. And I guess, maybe Al or Kathy, what are some resources for individuals who have been touched by sepsis? Because it is quite common. I don't want to say common, but a lot of people, as you have conversations about sepsis, people are like, oh, I know somebody, or my sister, or, this happened to somebody I know. As people start talking about it, we realize that it's impacting more and more individuals. So what are some resources for individuals who have this grief or were touched by sepsis in this way?
Well, there's tremendous resources available through, first of all, through the two advocacy organizations that I mentioned that are also educational. So very simply, if you put in sepsis.org, what will come up is the link to the website for Sepsis Alliance, and there's a tremendous amount of educational material for professionals, for consumers, ways to get involved, ways to support sepsis survivors and fellow sepsis survivors. The other site is if you just put in End Sepsis. .org, that will take you to the End Sepsis Rory Staunton legacy site, and that will bring up again tremendous resources. There are videos that are created for children, educate children. There's professional guidance. There's all sorts of materials. Also, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. If you put in CDC.gov and then search for sepsis, they have an entire site that's dedicated to sepsis, as well as the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, the Department of Health. But principally, I would refer you to the first two because they really go to the heart, I think, of what supports consumers, those who have lost individuals, sepsis survivors, as well as professionals in the community. In fact, one of those, the Sepsis Alliance actually came to the university a couple of years ago and filmed a module for national training of professionals in sepsis.
I was at
that. Was hosted by the School of Social Welfare.
I attended that. It was very informative. Very informative. I'm actually looking at the sepsis.org website, and I'm seeing a lot of just people sharing their stories, support resources, and things like that. So definitely a good website to check out.
Can I mention too that one of the things through either of these organizations, if someone wants to be involved, so for example, there are 5Ks that people sponsor. There's just awareness activities, and in particular, those that whose lives have been touched by sepsis or professionals that are really very involved in it will become involved in that way and sponsor events. And it's a way, just as Kathy said, it's a way of maintaining the legacy of your loved ones, or if you've experienced it, it's a way to help other people. So I would encourage the listeners, if this story moves you, to check into that site and see how you can be involved.
Kathy, is there anything else as we close here? And I feel like we could talk for a lot more time on this topic. It's so important, and your story is just so deeply felt and so important. But is there anything else that you would like to share with us, or sort of say in closing here?
Yes, thank you. I remember how much Lois always sought to protect children, and I wonder how she would feel if she knew how her own daughter and son have been affected. Is there any way that we as community members can volunteer to help children, even if it's small things? I'm not a medical professional, and God knows I'm not a good cook, but I can do some things. And maybe just community support would help people who are alone or isolated due to disability or fear to come out. We talk a lot about COVID sequestering, but some of these people have probably been sequestered for a lot longer. Mm-hmm. And what I'm just putting it out there. I know we can't answer it in the minutes that remain, but maybe we can figure something out going forward.
And
I hope so.
I do. And one of the reasons I love having you on, Kathy, and not just Al talking about sepsis and the warning signs and the resources, but I love having you on, Kathy, because, unfortunately you had to go through this situation, and you're still going through it. You're still processing everything, but you're able to offer insight to things that other individuals might not even think of, because you are going through it, and you're looking for ways to volunteer and share your sister's story. And the impact it had on you and your family. So I want to thank you for offering a different perspective and helping us all to think, whether it's us here on this show right now or those listening, to how we can best help individuals not only be aware of the signs and symptoms of sepsis, but for those who are family members and if we're going through this grieving process, what are ways that we can help each other and support each other? And I want to thank you for offering that today, because I know it probably was not easy to come on here and share all these emotions and feelings of what happened with your sister.
So appreciate that. You made my day, month, and year. So thank you.
And you're always welcome to come back, Kathy, if you want to come back to the social workers. And Al's always welcome as well. But Kathy, if you'd like to be a return guest at some point and talk more on the air with us, we're always open to having these conversations continue, because there is a lot to talk about and a lot to process, and always feel like we're cutting folks off at the end, and that's certainly not the intent.
Well, I am so grateful for this opportunity. Again, social workers, from my perspective, rock. Thank you for the extremely hard work you do. You're heroes. You've always been heroes. So we appreciate you.
Thank you. And I think, Eric, that's a great way to end the show, with social workers rock. I mean, I think that's, I like that. So thank you. And Eric, do you want to close out today?
I would just say that the reason that social workers rock is that they are inspired by persons like yourself and your sister and your brother-in-law and your parents. And that's why social workers do the work they do. And that's why they're so good at it, is that I think they're really inspired by the people and the communities they serve. So thank you for saying that, Kathy. So you've been listening to the Social Workers here on WCDB Albany. My name is Eric Hardiman, and I've been here with Alyssa Lotmore. We love bringing this show to you. We love talking to our listeners about social work, not just about social work, but about events, about community issues, about the need for information, and sharing personal stories and sharing professional wisdom in Al's case and expertise, and also your story too, Al, which was really remarkable that you shared with us. So thanks for listening to the Social Workers, and we will see you on the other side.
You're listening to The Social Workers on WCDB Albany.